Good evening. My name is Brent Orrell, and I'm a resident fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I want to welcome you all. For those of you who are, maybe this is your first visit to AEI, maybe you don't know what AEI is, we're a public policy think tank dedicated to defending human dignity, expanding human potential, and building a freer and safer world. To enhance this mission, AEI has intentionally focused a portion of its research on policies and practices that seek to better the lives of those at the margins of society, including the nearly 2 million individuals who are currently incarcerated in the United States. When I joined AEI less than a year ago, I was asked to lead our work on reentry programming for formerly incarcerated individuals. And my interest in this goes back more than 15 years to when I was the director for the Center for Faith-Based and Community Initiatives at the U.S. Department of Labor, where we created and implemented the first DOL employment-focused reentry programs. And that was a remarkable story, in part because we launched that initiative. President Bush, George W. Bush, took notice of that initiative and decided to put it into his 2004 State of the Union address to expand that initiative into the Prisoner Reentry Initiative, which then became the Second Chance Act. So out of small things become very important things. And so it's been my honor to be associated with this effort. In partnership with our other really amazing team of scholars here, we have delved further into this topic and continue AEI's tradition of robust scholarship addressing many of the difficult issues facing incarcerated populations. You may have seen these resources on some of these resources when you walked in, but I'd like to highlight just a couple of the recent pieces that AEI has produced. AEI is academic advisor on criminal justice, and he's also the director of research at the Minnesota Department of Corrections. His name is Grant Dewey. Published a study recently called The Importance of the Company You Keep, that looks at the importance of social and family support for individuals who are incarcerated. He has two more studies coming out very shortly, one on risk measurement, and then how we go about optimizing and timing the dosage of services to improve correctional outcomes. AEI Adjunct Fellow Gerard Robinson and our former colleague Elizabeth English Smith recently released a volume of papers entitled Education for Liberation, a collection of essays outlining the role of education programming in improving the futures of incarcerated individuals. My colleague Stan Voiger, an economist here at AEI, also recently released a study presenting evidence that ban-the-box policies can be eliminating those policies can be an important step in opening up meaningful employment opportunities to reentering individuals. In addition to these resources, Grant Dewey and I have been leading a reentry working group for the better part of the last year, and we're looking to we've tapped into lead researchers and evaluators of major federal reentry programs to identify what works, or perhaps more accurately, what might work in criminal justice programming, and we'll be releasing some findings on that this fall. While it's a distinct privilege to work on this important topic at AEI, I and my colleagues are aware that we play only a very small part in the larger constellation of organizations and advocates that are championing the cause of criminal justice reform. We're at a unique moment, Carroll and I were talking about this earlier, of bipartisan agreement. It's not easy to come by these days. And that agreement is about how our treatment of prisoners and the place we make for them in our society when they are released have fallen well short of what's needed. True progress on this will require unprecedented levels of cooperation between researchers, advocacy organizations, policy makers, and community practitioners. We're beginning to see that, and we welcome more of it in the days to come. And to that end, it's my privilege to welcome the Marshall Project to AEI. We applaud your work, and we're excited to be part of today's conversation. So now it's my pleasure to turn the program over to the Marshall Project's president, Carroll Bogert, who will introduce today's distinguished guests. Thanks.
Could I actually ask the panel just to come up now with me? So normally at the speaker series, some of you may have been to multiple Marshall Project talks about criminal justice reform, and this would be the moment where we play you a little video about ourselves, but we're going to skip that today because we think we have some really fabulous panelists, and we want you to hear as much as possible from them. So just so you know, the Marshall Project is a nonprofit media organization, nonpartisan, covering the criminal justice system. And you can find our work at themarshallproject.org. And if you're criminal justice nerds, which I know this audience is, you may already be reading us, but if not, you should be. So I think you have bios of the panelists in your material. Ken Frazier, the CEO of Merck, a position that he's held since 2011. And before that, Ken was a partner at the law firm of Drinkle, Biddle, and Reith in Philadelphia, and a pro bono death row lawyer, which we want to talk about a little bit. He's a native of Philadelphia. My favorite detail from Ken's bio is that his father read 2 newspapers every day, a man with a 3rd grade education. This is the son of a news junkie, and we like to hear that. To Ken's right is Genevieve Martin. Genevieve is the executive director of Dave's Killer Bread Foundation, which, as I think you know, advocates for the hiring of formerly incarcerated people or people with criminal backgrounds. She's produced multiple second chance summits which evangelizes for the hiring of formerly incarcerated people with business leaders from around the country, participated in Center for American Progress and Association of Chambers of Commerce executive task forces. She's presented at the International Corrections and Prisons Association, which is an organization that we were just discussing today. The Marshall Project would also love to be in touch with, so you're going to explain to us how to do that. And to Genevieve's right is Jeff Korzenik, a fellow Chicagoan, the chief investment strategist and senior vice president at Fifth Third Investment Management Group. So he's responsible for the bank's overall client investment strategy. He's a regular guest on CNBC's Squawk Box and on Bloomberg. And he's really a leading expert on private sector models for the reemployment of ex-offenders. So with that, I'd like to turn first to you, if I could, Ken, to explore a little bit your very unusual background, not just as a lawyer, but as a lawyer who cared about death row. Let's start with the fact that we're both mutually fans of Thurgood Marshall. Sure. That's the man for whom the Marshall Project is named. And he was an inspiration for you to become a lawyer, is that fair to say?
Absolutely. So I come by it honestly. I was born 7 months to the day after the Brown decision was rendered in July of 1954. And I grew up in a house where there was a lot of information and a lot of materials and a lot of debate and discussion about what was happening at that point, the transition that was happening in America as America was beginning to grapple with the huge gap between the rhetoric of the Declaration and the Constitution and the reality of America in the 1950s and 1960s. And so people tend to think of the civil rights movement as being generally one that was driven by the very important work done by Martin Luther King and others. But I learned very early on about the precursor work done by Thurgood Marshall and a very brave set of lawyers who started cases back in the late 1930s aimed at dismantling the legal premise for racial inferiority that existed particularly in the South. And so as I learned more and more about these things, including Brown, and I had a mentor, the late Bill Coleman, who was one of the people who was on the Brown brief, I realized that lawyers have an opportunity to actually make a huge difference in people's lives.
Now, when you were at Harvard Law School, you also spent a semester in Soweto in South Africa.
No, that was later. Actually, I spent a number of semesters. After I became a lawyer, I had an opportunity to go teach law school during apartheid in South Africa because, of course, South African black lawyers were given, again, not access, very much like before Brown. It was before Brown in South Africa. And so I had an opportunity to teach 6 semesters there. And in a fit of enthusiasm, one semester I decided to stay with some friends in Soweto. It was maybe not the best experience I ever had, but I learned what it was like to live in Soweto, which was a completely lawless place because the only police forces in South Africa were there to contain people. So they surrounded Soweto so that people couldn't get out of Soweto, but there was absolutely nothing to protect people inside Soweto.
Right. Well, and then you became an associate and partner at a prestigious Philadelphia law firm. What led you to want to do pro bono work on death row?
So I was born and raised in the inner city of Philadelphia. I went to law school, went to Harvard Law School. I got over it, by the way. And before I went to that law school, I did not know that there were large firms of lawyers who represented businesses. My conception of a lawyer was Thurgood Marshall, or the lawyers that I knew in the inner city of Philadelphia who represented people charged with criminal offenses, or maybe did real estate deals or whatever. So I was used to thinking of lawyers as instruments of good for individuals. Then I got to law school, realized that you had to take out huge loans, and you probably wanted to go work for a law firm where you made a lot of money. But when I went to that law firm, I chose the particular law firm I went to because Drinker, Biddle, and Reith had a very long history of doing important pro bono cases, including at the Supreme Court of the United States level. So having my choice between these firms, I opted for firms that has a core value doing pro bono work.
And what led you to the death row case that you took on?
So in all honesty, we had just had a baby. I was involved.
That's a funny way to begin an answer to that question.
My wife and I had just had our first child, and I was very busy with a lot of paying clients at that time. I'd gotten to be a young partner, and I started having my own clients and flying. I was a jury trial lawyer, so I was flying around the country doing different trials. And I got a phone call from a friend one afternoon, the late Esther Lardent, who was at that time running the ABA's post-conviction death penalty project. And she was at wit's end because she had a client who was facing a sentence of death being carried out in a couple of weeks and had no representation.
A couple of weeks?
Yes, he had no representation at the time. And she said, if you don't take this case, it was a Friday afternoon, I can still remember it, this man's going to be executed without representation. And even then, I wasn't immediately moved to do it because I had a new baby at home. But after we talked about it a little bit, it seemed to me, she said, I just ask you to go down, meet Mr. Cochran, and consider doing something to stay the execution date. And so like a fool, I said, I can just do that little thing. But once you go down there and you meet the client, there's no way you walk away from a representation like that.
Right. And can you talk a little bit about the issues at play in the case, because they are still at play in our legal system today, all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court at this very moment?
Absolutely. So can I talk a little bit about the case?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating case.
So my client at that point had been on death row for about 15 years for a murder that happened after a store was robbed in Alabama, obviously. The facts of the case, according to what the state proved, was that my client was arrested on an interstate. By the way, I should disclose that from the minute I met my client, he was very clear that he was involved in the robbery. But he was very clear that he didn't shoot anybody, okay? So he was arrested in an interstate after the robbery occurred. And this is the part of the story that, as a Northerner, I don't get at all. The news went out, or the information went out over the police band radio, and citizens joined in the chase, right? Which is not something you expect to see. At one point, the chase centered on a darkened trailer park. A single gunshot is heard. Again, my client is not arrested in that trailer park. He's arrested far away from the trailer park. When I first met my client, you do what lawyers do. You say, we're here to talk about your stay. I want to ask you some questions that are germane to your stay. I don't want you to tell me anything else because you may constrain my ability to represent you later on. And he said, that's all well and good, Mr. Frazier. I didn't shoot the decedent. The police shot him by mistake. Now, I had been representing people. I'd never had a death row case, but I did a lot of criminal cases. And I knew that there were absolutely no guilty people in jail when you first talk to them, okay? And so when he told me that, it went in one ear and out the other because we're focused on the stay. But what we learned years later, when we actually got to take discovery in the case, was his version of the story was exactly what happened. as the search, centered on this dark trailer park at night, the police were there, and they shot one of the people who were pursuing the so-called robber by mistaken identity. And I know that because when we finally found the records for the trailer park, which had been sold many times over, we found the person who lived closest to the murder, knocked on his door in Texas, and he said, I've been literally waiting for 15 years to have this conversation. And he told us exactly the same story that my client told me because he witnessed it. And the police said, well, we'll come back to you later. And of course, they never came back to him, right? And so my client was on death row for 15 years. And he was convicted in a trial. Frankly, I should tell you a couple of things. He didn't meet his defense lawyer until the morning of his trial. The defense lawyer in that small town, I have to say, only went through the motions because he was a young lawyer and he knew that if he put on a zealous defense that he'd never make any money for the rest of his career, and at least not in that area. The jury that convicted my client was almost all white. There was one black on the jury, 11 whites and one black on the jury, who happened to be a friend of the prosecutor, the one black juror who golfed with the prosecutor. And the prosecutor had a practice of striking all black jurors because he thought black people were unreliable jurors generally, and particularly unreliable when the defendant was black, and particularly if the defendant was black and the decedent was white. So we were able to go into federal court and demonstrate that he was poorly represented and that the jury was selected on the basis of race, what's called a Batson violation. And as a result, we got relief. I should just skip to the end of the story. When he was retried, the jury acquitted him in less than an hour for something that he'd been on death row for 19 years for. And on the blackboard in the jury deliberation room were the words, "Not enough evidence." And there was never enough evidence to convict him. And in fact, I'll just stop here. The crime for which he was actually being tried was a crime that no law student would say applied to the facts, because he was tried under a part of the Alabama Penal Code that made it a death-eligible homicide if there's a robbery and you kill the witnesses during the course of the robbery. That's standard, right? Because you don't want people killing people just so that it can't be identified. But under the Penal Code of Alabama at the time, it was abundantly clear that if the murder occurred in the flight from the robbery versus during the course of the robbery, it wasn't during the course of the robbery. So, in fact, they had to shoehorn this man into a crime that they thought provided the justice that they wanted, because ultimately it was a police shooting. I'll stop here. The guy we found in Texas many years later testified that when he looked outside, he saw a police officer bent over a body and another police officer trying to get the police officer who was bent over, and that police officer was weeping, okay? It couldn't have been clearer, all right? So this is one of those cases where I can say that not only was he denied effective representation, but he was in fact exonerated for the murder.
Incredible. It's an incredible case. And it's interesting because, as you all are probably aware, if you listen to In the Dark, that podcast, Curtis Flowers, this case has now gone to the Supreme Court on precisely the issue of peremptory challenge.
Absolutely.
Where the prosecutor throws all the black people off the jury. And that it was on that basis.
And we were lucky because the prosecutor in the case, who was clear that he actually had these racist feelings about black jurors, the one redeeming quality of the prosecutor is that under oath, he would not lie. He was willing to say, yeah, I don't like black jurors. I got my reasons for it. We would never have gotten relief if that prosecutor was willing to make up, juror by juror, a non-racial explanation for why he struck all the black, which is what usually happens to black defendants, right? The prosecutor says, well, I know it looks like there's a pattern of striking black jurors, but in fact, I have an explanation for each and every one of those jurors that's completely non-racial. In fact, they'll tell me I'm colorblind. Right? So we're very fortunate that he, with all of his horrible aspects of his personality, the one thing he wouldn't do was lie under oath.
Well, and it was rather remarkable that Merck, where you had then moved to the legal department, was willing to allow you to continue to pursue this case on their dime and their time.
I'm quite sure I'm the only company lawyer who's ever tried a death penalty case.
You may be the only company CEO who's ever tried a death penalty.
That might be true, too.
Okay. Many reasons why
The
Ken...
CEO part is an overrated experience, though, let me say.
All right, well, we're going to get to the CEO part in a minute. I want to turn, Jeff, to you, and I think you have some really illuminating slides that are going to sort of bring the issue of criminal justice and what the business community can do, in addition to getting people off death row, which not that many people in the business community can do. That's something only Ken Frazier can do. But maybe you could explain a little bit.
Let me start out by, we work this problem from the other end. We look at this from the standpoint of how can people with criminal records or coming out of incarceration re-enter the workforce? And the starting point for us is really the economic imperative of growing your workforce. We get this data that you see before you from the Congressional Budget Office, and it represents the growth limitations of the economy over periods of time. And the CBO uses the widely accepted notion that your growth is limited to, is constrained by how fast can you grow your workforce and how productive can they be over the long term. Not every year, but over the course of time. And what you'll see in the charts before you, the blue lines are productivity, the green lines are workforce growth. Productivity growth is a result of investment largely, and there are ultimately diminishing returns on investment. You can only grow your productivity by so much. But workforce growth is a matter of demographics, largely. And what you'll see is that if you accept the CBO's projections, that last bar on the right says that our growth is going to be constrained in the United States for the next decade on average to 1.9% a year, which is pretty paltry. And we don't fully accept that. But our starting point is observing that the reason our growth has been slowing is because we've been unable to grow our workforce. Now, some of that, of course, is natural because we don't have the entry of the baby boomers. The baby boomers are exiting. But it's more than that. And this becomes a particularly acute problem today when we're 10 years into this economic expansion, and we have to look at our current rate of unemployment. This is the chart, and forgive me, I know not everyone's a chart person. This goes back to 1948. It represents the US rate of unemployment. The vertical gray areas you see are periods of recession. The big white areas between those recessions are, of course, recoveries and expansions. And what I'd ask you to observe is that during those expansions, as you would expect, the unemployment rate goes down and down and down, but then gets stuck. Essentially, we reach a point of full employment. And when you get to full employment, you'll see that typically within a year or 18 months, the next recession comes. So a lot is at stake. And if you were to look at where we are today at a 3.6% unemployment rate, you could easily be led to believe that there's a recession right around the corner. But of course, that's only half of the story. The other story is this concept of labor force participation rate. Again, we go back to 1948, the start of modern data collection in the United States. And you can see that big upswing in the middle of the 80s and 90s was rising labor force participation rates, the entry of the baby boomers, and critically rising female labor force participation rates. That's one of the main reasons we grew so well in those decades. But by 2000, that had tapped out, and we've seen declining labor force participation rates, and that's been an impediment to growth. Here's the thing. If you look at why we've seen declining labor force participation rate, only half of it is explained by the baby boomers exiting the workforce. We started studying this at Fifth Third about 5 years ago, and we came to the conclusion that there were 3 social ills present this cycle in ways that had never been present in modern American economic history. Long-term unemployment, the opioid epidemic, and the incarceration recidivism cycle. We've simply sidelined too many workers that didn't need to be sidelined. And the challenge is, can you bring these people back? When you look at those different populations, the richest opportunity are the people who are underemployed or out of the workforce because they have a criminal record. Different measurements here. You'll see 19 million people have a felony conviction in the United States. You subtract the 2+ million who are currently incarcerated. That's 16+ million Americans with a felony conviction. Now, some of them are in the workforce, but many of them are, almost all of them are underemployed. And we flip this and think of this as an opportunity. And it's fortunately an opportunity that some pioneering small businesses that we've come to know, have really capitalized on. And so we've studied businesses. We found that there's a way to reemploy people with records, and that it is not just a macroeconomic benefit, but is a benefit to company bottom lines. People with records, if you can, partnering with nonprofits, employing government agency support, if you can identify the people who are ready to turn their life around and support them with various needs, it's good business. Very, in a time of tight labor and high turnover, low turnover, which means low cost and highly dedicated employees. What's the cost of doing nothing? Well, we need 1.25 million workers a year. Half of that comes from immigration and natural population growth. Where could the rest come from? Well, about 600,000 come out of prisons. No one quite knows the number that come out of jail. Maybe if we were better utilizing those resources. 11.5 million people are using opioids for non-medicinal purposes. 2+ million are addicts. If we could help people get through that. If we don't, this cycle will come to an end. We'll hit this next recession. By our estimate, we're missing at least 2 to 3 million workers. That's a couple of years of extra expansion. What's each year of expansion worth? We're, big round numbers, a $20 trillion economy growing at 2.5% a year. That's $500 billion a year that we leave on the sidelines by not addressing this.
Now, Jeff, you evangelized for this in all kinds of business forums. What is the reaction of business leaders when you present them with this information?
Progressively better as the labor markets get tighter. And most of we are, for those of you not familiar with Fifth Third, we're essentially the bankers to the industrial heartland of the Midwest to the Southeast. And our core client is a business that might have a couple hundred to a couple thousand employees, and often family-owned, multi-generational family businesses. They're deeply invested in their communities, and they're just looking for pathways. I've never had anyone say, I don't think this is the right thing to do. They just need to make sure it makes business sense for them to do it.
Well, since we have a business leader here on the stage, maybe I could ask him. Ken, when you see Jeff's slides, what's your reaction in your capacity as CEO of Merck?
So it's clear that we have an imperative across this country to employ these people. I think the challenge that I think we have, and we talked about it behind here, is that often people have a very stereotypical view of ex-offenders. And what we have to be able to do is to get them out of a situation where they're being judged simply by something that they did in the past, and be able to present them as human beings, as individuals, to be able to present them in a way that people can see what they've done since then and all the redeeming qualities, including, chief among them, how badly they actually want to get a job.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Genevieve, you've done a lot of work in very practical sense with businesses to help them understand what they can do and how they can actually practically hire formerly incarcerated people. What are the practical considerations that a business leader needs to take into account?
Well, the really good news is this is very simple. So we call it second chance employment, and that's meaningfully employing people with criminal backgrounds in your workforce. That's it. When I say meaningful, I mean we're doing this thoughtfully and thinking about what do we have in our organization that's available, that's a natural entry point to then promote throughout the organization. To look at individuals on an individual basis. This is a case-by-case basis. It's not a blanket. We are categorically taking a group of people and saying, well, you are of less value than everybody else that we're interviewing and assessing. So the practicality is we have low unemployment. We have hundreds of thousands of jobs that are open across the country, many of them in industries where you can actually get an entry-level job and promote through relatively simply. So in manufacturing and hospitality. And very few industries are actually closed to this group of people that need employment. One of my favorite examples is our friends at Johns Hopkins. Most people automatically assume healthcare is off the table. There's no possible chance that somebody in healthcare is going to employ people with felony convictions. And it's true, you can get an exclusion that says, we won't hire, we work with vulnerable populations, we're just not going to touch this. Johns Hopkins actually says, no, we are publicly going to tell you that we hire people. We are going to meaningfully recruit people with felony convictions. And over the last several years, they've employed over 2,000 people with criminal backgrounds. And they've done this intentionally. And in all of that time, of the more than 2,000 employees with backgrounds, only one person has been problematic, and it was related to their criminal background and the behaviors that came with it. Now, of all the businesses that I know, and of all the people I've ever employed and the people that I've worked with that I've employed, those odds are amazing. Hiring 2,000 people and having one person be problematic, like, I will take those odds, absolutely. When I think about all the people I've hired over the years and that I've seen in our organization at Dave's Killer Bread, which I didn't tell you anything about, by the way, when I think about where we've had problematic scenarios, it has almost never been somebody with a background, and it has certainly never been linked to the fact that somebody had a background. It's always been completely isolated from that.
Take a second and talk about Dave's Killer Bread, because it's
Sure.
an amazing thing.
Show of hands, how many have heard of Dave's Killer Bread? Not too bad. Okay, good. Okay, so Dave's Killer Bread is the #1 selling sliced organic bread in the country. We are distributed all the way across the United States and across Canada. We've maintained that position as #1 since May of 2015 and have not moved from that spot since. And we're far ahead of our competition, so yay. So at the end of the day, we're just a sliced bread company. Like, seriously, we're a manufacturing plant. We produce bread. That's it. But Dave, if you're familiar with the logo, it's this big, muscly guy playing a guitar. He's a cartoon. Is a real person. He grew up in the family bakery. He hated it. He wanted nothing to do with baking. He thought it was for wussies, and he did not want to be a dude that baked. And so in his teenage years, he was fighting what he really later found out was depression, and ended up self-medicating. So he turned to substance abuse, and over the years, he had to come up with creative ways of coming by these substances when he couldn't afford them. And that resulted in 4 different stints in prison. The 4th time in, his older brother, who by then had taken over the family bakery, was visiting him in prison about 6 months before his release, which was in 2004, and said, something's different about Dave this time. Every other time, Dave's been scapegoating. He's been saying it's somebody else's problem. It wasn't he didn't get himself here. But this time, Dave wasn't handling it that way. So Glenn said, come back to the family bakery. You have a job. Come live with me. Dave didn't want to do it. He said, nope, it's for wussies, not baking. He had ideas. He had dreams. He's a very creative individual. And when he got out, he realized he couldn't get a job because he had the scarlet letter F, and it wasn't going to happen. So he came back to the bakery. He worked entry-level work all the way up through, even though he knew how to bake. He'd grown up doing this. And about 6 months in, when Glenn said, okay, he's come to work every day. He's come on time. He hasn't pulled the entitlement card. He hasn't pulled the family card. I'm going to give him a project. And he said, Dave, you've always been creative. I want you to make bread cool again. Now, I should remind you, this is in 2005. At the height of Atkins, carbs are bad, don't eat carbs, is what everybody said. And we're trying to sell you bread. So Dave created the first 4 recipes of Dave's Killer Bread. We started selling them in our local Portland Farmers Market. And I was hired in 2010. By then, we were in 4 states along the Pacific Northwest. And then, like I said, by May of 2015, fast forward 10 years, we were the #1 selling sliced organic bread in the country. So
I think
we've
you have
been busy.
A lot of customers here, right? Y'all are going to be buying Dave Killer Bread.
And 40% of our workforce have felony convictions in their past. It's not something that we hide. We publicly talk about it. Our workforce loves to talk about it. They're constantly coming to us saying, when can I share my story? How can I tell people what this job has meant and who I am now?
Fascinating story. Congratulations. Jeff, can you talk a little bit about the special challenges for banks? The
Sure.
regulations keeping formerly incarcerated people
Sure.
out of the industry. Can that change? How can that change?
It's already started to change. The FDIC limits, has regulatory limits on what backgrounds people can have. But some of those, and this is a very typical situation, blanket restrictions get out there, and this is true in government contracts, vendor contracts for corporations, these broad restrictions. And again, in response to the tight labor market, banks like ours actually went to the FDIC, a regulator, and have developed broader entry points, I guess you'd call them. So people with a DWI 10 years ago, right, are no longer excluded. And it's very technical. And there's also a special type of exemption. They're very difficult to get. But it is opening up, I think, for a very heavily regulated industry like ours to start opening is representative of the times. We actually see that. We also see great opportunities in manufacturing, which is rebounding in the US. And that's an easy one because it's not customer facing, not handling money. So some of those barriers that employers have in their mind are gone. And skills that don't need advanced degrees often can be, in some cases, can be taught in prison. I've been to the vocational villages in Michigan, the Michigan prison system that give trade credentialing. There's a lot of opportunities across the industries.
Jeff sent me a clip last week of Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase being interviewed by CNN. He's really a tribune for this hiring formerly incarcerated people. And he's asked point blank by the CNN interview, do you mean to say, Mr. Dimon, that you would hire an ex-felon to work at your bank? And he says, yes, I would. I mean, he just doesn't flinch from it. And I have to say, he carries a lot of weight in a lot of places. And he can't alone change the FDIC regulations or bring the banking industry with him, but it helps.
And I can tell you when for these kind of discussions, I know our HR attorneys like me to stress that everything we do will be in compliance with our regulatory requirements, and we're not going around those.
Okay.
But the world is changing, and that's a good thing.
Well, if your HR people are watching the live stream, as many people do, you heard Jeff. Ken, talk about what this would mean for a company like Merck, which employs really very highly skilled workers to create very complex pharmaceutical products. Is it viable for Merck to think about hiring formerly incarcerated people?
So I have to say it is viable. You just hit the nail on the head. So many jobs in our company require scientific, engineering, technical training, right? And so, and even the manufacturing is more computer-driven than it was 20 years ago. But having said that, as we've been saying over and over again, the challenge is to look for entry-level jobs, and we are doing that. We have, for example, with inner city kids, the Year Up program. We try to find entry-level programs. Similarly, we have to say, what are those programs that ex-offenders can come in and get a toehold, and then perhaps think about how you can develop that. But I will say that I think our challenge has been traditionally the fact that so much of our workforce has advanced degrees, often technical degrees. But as we were saying as we were talking out there, we have vendors. I mean, the fact of the matter is we have vendors who do construction work. They do maintenance work. They do lawn and landscaping work. They do cafeteria work. I think we have to make sure that we look across the spectrum, not just of our own FTEs, but everyone who's employed.
The company so far has maybe done more at the sort of front end of the system, so to speak, to keep young men and women out of prison by employing them when they may be from at-risk populations. Right.
If I can interject.
Please do, because I know you have a lot of practical advice about how to go about
I think,
this.
like we were saying in the beginning, a key thing that we have to think about is all kinds of people have criminal backgrounds. All kinds of people have been incarcerated. So people with extremely large, PhDs and degrees that are far more educated than I am are incarcerated and have felony convictions. And they then suffer from the same barriers to employment and to housing and to benefits that everybody else does. Then we also have, I think, what the general public tends to kind of bucket as like, this is the group of people we're talking about that are going to come into entry-level work and then work their way in. But we're talking about everyone is represented within this pool of formerly incarcerated people and people with felony convictions. And so that's why this individual assessment is so key. And also why whenever I hear a company say, similar to what you're saying, Jeff, of, okay, well then we just won't put them in customer service. And I'm like, no, that's crap. No, because it's a dumb rule. And it's because depending on the person, you're always hiring the best person for the job, regardless of background. So if you're interviewing them and you've banned the box, you've taken it off the application, this is not a part of the assessment until we've given you the conditional offer of employment, which is kind of the gold standard now. If you've decided this person's a good fit and you trust, I trust my gut, this is the person I want on the job, and then you do the background check and you go, okay, there's something here, but guess what? That thing has nothing to do with the job I've hired you for. It's fine. It's totally fine. And you're in compliance. You're completely within EEOC guidance. You're not going to get in trouble from your employment attorney. Your insurance broker's not going to care because you're completely within your right to do that, and it will not impact that. And so I just had to interject.
Indeed, you had to.
Sorry.
I know, Jeff, you have recommended that companies actually work with nonprofits who can
Yes.
help to source this workforce. How does that work?
So what we've found is that the best model is letting a nonprofit build a relationship with the returning citizen. And it's very hard for a hiring manager, business manager, in the brief period that they are going to get to know that candidate to really know who's ready. Because there's such formidable barriers. It really takes a lot to re-enter the workforce successfully. So our suggestion is to let the nonprofits essentially act as a staffing agency for putting forth candidates. And then there's also the requirement where typically, and this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with a criminal record, but is rather has to do with poverty that is often associated with this population. Those present all sorts of barriers to staying employed. Transportation, housing, food insecurity, childcare, all these things. And so that if you want to retain this candidate and make them be a successful employee, you need to make some accommodations and partner with either government agencies or nonprofits. And some businesses go a step further. They will get essentially a navigator in staff. There's a great company in Ohio, JBM Packaging, that hired a life coach for all their employees. Originally, it was just intended to support the employees who had records, but they found it's benefiting their entire workforce. Nehemiah Manufacturing says, their CEO Dan Myers says, I don't have an HR people. I have social service providers. And then one last one, which I think is really neat, Cascade Engineering in Western Michigan trains all their supervisors by putting them through a poverty simulation so they get it.
Fascinating. Well, you mentioned the human resources managers, and I think sometimes the opposition to hiring this workforce may come not from the CEO, but from the HR person who feels nervous about moving in this direction. I don't know if this is a conversation you've had within your company, Ken, but...
No, we haven't had it specifically on the issue of formerly incarcerated people, although, this motivates me to have that conversation. But, an analogous conversation is the one that I'd referred to before. When we work with organizations like Europe and you're bringing kids who have been disadvantaged from an inner city community, you still have to deal with the fact that human beings tend to think about things in categories and they think about them automatically. And so if certain people come from what I would call a high status group, if you know almost nothing else about them, they look kind of good to people who put people in categories. If you put people who come from what society would call a lower status group, that's a challenge for many times for the hiring managers. I found that, for example, when I was running the legal department, we were able to hire people into certain kinds of jobs, like in our patent group, patent filing, things of that nature. If you could get past the stereotype and bring the personality and value to you could change it. And I think that's the challenge we have. It's not just an ex-offender issue. It's the fundamental challenge about diversity in our society, is that we tend, as human beings, to think automatically. And part of that is to put people in buckets. And so we say, am I going to take somebody out of this bucket? That's really not the relevant question. It's what is this individual and what is this person's abilities and what's their drive, et cetera.
It's the individual assessment
Right.
that Genevieve is talking about. But I think one of the interesting things that's going on right now, and Genevieve, I know you know a lot about this, is the Society of Human Resources Management, SHRM, which is really kind of changing its tune, perhaps responding to what Jeff has identified, this labor shortage in America. I know you've collaborated with SHRM on some programs. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, as early as this morning. So Society for Human Resource Management, for those of you that don't know, is the largest HR association in the country. And then they have education partners all over the world. So they're kind of a force to be reckoned with. If you have an HR professional on your team, they likely have SHRM credentials because they have to do continuing education. So SHRM's kind of a big deal. Last year, Johnny Taylor, their new CEO, came in and said, we have 3 priorities moving forward. And for the first time ever, employment of people with criminal backgrounds is one of those top 3 initiatives, which is why we get to work with them so much now, because that's all I talk about. So we have been speaking at some of their conferences. We have plans to go all the way out through 2020. But how do we work directly with their membership to help not only just inspire them with all of these things to say, like, this is necessary for all of us. This impacts every single person if we're paying our taxes, right? On average, it costs about $600 per American household out of our own taxes to incarcerate. Ugh, think about how much that is just in this room. That's disgusting. So when we think about how we bring people back into the workforce, SHRM's been really, really thoughtful about that. They've had us conduct a reentry simulation, so much like a poverty simulation, a reentry simulation. So we got to put a bunch of their HR membership at their talent conference through a 2-hour exercise of what does it look like to be day one out of the gate from incarceration? How do you navigate the community and all of your probationary requirements and all of your just living requirements? And by the way, succeed and not go back to jail. It's really fun because most people go back to jail at least once in the 4-week round that we do. So it's a very eye-opening experience. We could bring that to Merck. That could be pretty powerful. Just saying.
You know, if I could also just shout out also one other sort of sign of the times, the SHRM Getting Talent Back to Work, gettingtalentbacktowork.org. There's also the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has a new initiative to help employers deal with employees who are struggling with addiction, specifically opioid addiction. And so there's a much greater focus in the business community about how do you help people who are facing challenges that the business community is not used to helping with.
I think it does feel like a little bit of a tide is turning, which is precisely why we're having this panel discussion today. Could you address, Jeff, the question of ban the box? And I think Brent mentioned that AEI has some research on, there's controversy over whether when you ban the box, do you in fact kind of extrapolate or expand discrimination against young men of color generally because the employer is not able to know whether this man of color has a criminal record or not. And I think AEI has some strong research on this, but what is your knowledge?
Our take on this is there's no silver bullets, there's no single policy change, and our concerns with ban the box are some of the research that's been out there that has suggested that employers practice avoidance, and that avoidance could take an illegal form of discriminating against people they deem to be more likely to have a criminal record or otherwise be unsuitable, so you're capturing a broader community than you want. But we did a thumbnail sketch. It can also be in ways that are legal. So we did a quick study of states that had banned the box and states that didn't and compared the average duration of unemployment. And this was by no means a robust study, but what we found was that states that had banned the box had longer durations of unemployment, which suggested that employers may be saying, well, if there's a big gap in employment, maybe they spent that incarcerated. So that's one problem. But the data is mixed, and there's some studies that show some real benefits to it. And I've had a friend who's benefited with a record because someone got to meet him. So I'm not religious on this, but I do feel strongly that if we go where we need to go in hiring people with records, we need to do this with intentionality, meaning that the business owner has to understand the challenges that people from this population are going to face. Again, it's usually challenges of poverty, and that if you just do it sort of willy-nilly, well, now that I've done the background check, I see he has a record, but I liked him, often that's not going to lead to success. Employers who haven't followed this kind of model of partnering with nonprofits have told me, I've hired people with records before, they're either my best employee or my worst employee, and about even. The problem is that one bad employee undoes the good of 10 good employees. So you need to follow a model that ensures a high degree of success, and I'm not sure that ban the box lends itself to that.
I want to go back to the data that you talked about a few minutes ago, and I know I'm not supposed to be asking questions,
You can ask
but it's been
questions.
in my mind the whole time. So we're now almost at, for all practical purposes, at least a recent historic low with respect to unemployment. Do you find that it is useful, as you look at different employers, to find those employers where they have the greatest labor shortages and target them for this?
We're not that specific. We hold events around the country or within our footprint, and generally partner with a business publication. So we just did one in Cleveland with Cranes. We just did one with Charlotte with the Charlotte Business Journal. And we see what sticks. What I think works most effectively is, and where we've seen success, is regions of the country where one pioneering business owner does this successfully and raises his hand and says, look at this. So if you look at the Western Michigan, there's maybe 20 plus companies that are doing this. Greater Cincinnati area is up to 60-ish companies that are doing this. It's really because of these pioneering business owners, and they frankly deserve a lot of more acclaim and respect than they get. They put their money on their line, their livelihood. If it's a family-owned business, their legacy.
Well, and at that big scale, I think that's part of why Jamie Dimon, not to keep returning to him, but he's a man who carries a lot of weight in the community. So when you have one person who will take the lead and be public about it, it's very important. I wanted to ask about that a little, because we are aware at the Marshall Project, where I should say we don't want to ban the box because we actively seek employees who are formerly incarcerated. That's what we need. We cover the criminal justice system, and we need people who understand it. But when we have looked at businesses that are hiring formerly incarcerated people, we don't find that they always want to say so out loud. That they're actually worried, and you mentioned the consumer-facing businesses. Do I want to put somebody right up front who has a criminal record? Is there some way to turn the tide on that issue and help businesses understand that it can be a positive? Will it be a positive necessarily for them to say out loud, I hire formerly incarcerated?
Over time, I think that's absolutely the case. So we work with a small group of companies that we've dubbed the Second Chance Business Coalition that publicly talk about it. And that's the whole impetus of this group, is that you will publicly say we are committed to this work and we do it. And that's why second chance employment is, I think, so important, especially in this ban the box conversation, is whether you ban the box or not, or are required to or not, what we've learned in our business practices and what many of our partners have is the box is fine, take it off, don't, whatever. But the important part is when you get to have the conversation and meet the person. So that's how you do that individual assessment. That's how you know if this is applicable or not. With the business community, there's this very natural spot where people will go public or they won't. And at the moment, I would say it's probably an acceptable one, but over time it will be unacceptable. And that is, what is your service or product? So if you do commercial landscaping, should be fine. If you do residential services, you're probably not going to publicly talk about it because the individual consumer feels uncomfortable knowing that you're going to come in and do housekeeping or landscaping. I don't agree with that. You would lose my business if you said, I don't hire people with felony convictions. However, there's not a big enough kind of general population belief in that quite yet. But we see that tide turning. SHRM, in partnership with Coke, recently did some surveys that demonstrated that about 75% of Americans are comfortable purchasing goods and products and services from companies that do hire people with criminal backgrounds. So that's good news. On the flip side of that coin, though, is most consumers don't know which companies do. So how do you, and we know that we're in a time now where the demographic of the people that are purchasing their goods and services want to vote with their dollars. And so we see this as a very powerful moment to say, if you don't have a cause, make this your cause. And if you have a cause, guess what? This goes really well with it, because at the end of the day, we're saying invest in your number one asset, which is your people. And your people in your workforce need to be reflective of your community and of your consumer. And so if you're missing an entire body of people just simply because they have a background you're unfamiliar with or feel uncomfortable with because you've never interacted with it, and so you get the heebie-jeebies, it's not a good enough reason to completely discount them from your workforce.
I'm going to jump in also. The arts have a role to play here in humanizing the other in general, but particularly people with records. There's a lot of room for more plays and books and TV shows. I'll give a quick shout out to Victory Gardens Theater in Chicago. Did a world premiere of a play called Letty by the playwright Boo Killebrew, a New York-based playwright, and it's fantastic. It captures it all. One character who's ready for re-entry, one who's not. It has nothing to do with the crime, the role of faith and family and rebuilding and the challenges. We need to see more of that.
A friend of mine who's formerly incarcerated has said, why is it that in Hollywood, at a certain point Hollywood made everybody had a gay friend? So why doesn't the hero just have a formerly incarcerated friend? like not something that's even necessarily a central part of the plot, just like a regular, like you have a formerly incarcerated friend, because guess what? There are millions of them in America. Is there something that we could do with the entertainment industry? And some of you may know we've had previous speaker series engaging precisely people from the entertainment industry to discuss this very question.
Ant-Man can help with that.
Ant-Man.
Ant-Man.
Oh, wow, Genevieve, I haven't seen it. Okay.
Okay, well, he's formerly
Oh,
incarcerated.
sorry.
Ant-Man himself has a few felonies.
But I mean, Marin Shakespeare Company has a troupe of people who've been formerly incarcerated who perform Shakespeare. There's a whole Shakespeare in prison movement, but taking it outside.
Well, you've said to me, Jeff, that you have found business leaders sort of coming to you almost on the side and saying quietly, I'm interested in doing this, but I'm not sure I want it to be public. So
Yes.
are you feeling a shift in the people
No,
that you talk
that's
to?
still, it depends on the business, and it depends on the location. If you look at Brown Superstores in Philadelphia, a chain of supermarkets, they take care of the food deserts, and very successfully. 600 of their 3,000 employees are people with records. Phenomenal. And in the stores, Jeff Brown, the CEO, told me the stores that are in the inner city, people go out of their way to shop there. They support the business. They look out for the business because they see what he's doing for the community. In the suburban stores, it's a little quieter.
Well, I also think there's the issue of what happens when you, in your internal workforce, when you've made too much of a point of why this person's different, right? I mean, when I was talking about the people that we hired, not necessarily with criminal records, but with, with some hiccup in their background. Like, Merck used to be extremely fastidious about things that, in my view, were not necessarily employment related, like credit checks and things like that. We overcame that, or people who had misdemeanor situations. When you overcame that, the last thing you wanted to do was to say, now I want credit for hiring this person, because that person's just like everybody else in the workforce. So I think there's two sides to this.
And that then becomes a data challenge too,
Right.
because some of the employers that hire people with records understandably don't want to separate this group out, so you can't get the data on what good employees they are.
Right.
It does actually work as a recruiting advantage, though. Once you do become public, we don't have to recruit. We are constantly turning people away that are talented, capable people from our doors. Because at our full capacity, we can hire 250 people at a time. We have talent that comes to our door every day that we have to turn away because we're fully staffed. We can't make the impact that's needed in the country, just Merck, just us, can't do it. But if we all together are taking percentages of our workforce and making sure that we're being very thoughtful about who we're bringing in, then we start to see national impact. So I think it's less about kind of replacing widgets and numbers, and it's all, is it the best person for the job? I don't care what walk of life you came from. Just know that often it's going to be somebody with a background. With 70 million Americans with criminal records, the odds, that's 1 in 3 of us in this room right now. So that's pretty big. It's pretty powerful.
It is. I want the audience to start thinking of the questions that they have for our panelists. But first, I want to give word to one more person in the room. So just to tell you about the Marshall Project, we run a weekly column called Life Inside, usually written by somebody who's incarcerated. And about a year ago, we ran a column from a guy called Lawrence Bartley, who'd been 27 years in prison and was preparing for parole. When he came out of prison, it was a beautiful piece. I urge you all to read it. When he came out of prison, he came to the Marshall Project, did a little brown bag with our staff. And we knew right away that we wanted Lawrence Bartley to work at the Marshall Project. And we brought him on as a fellow, and it wasn't very long before Lawrence Bartley came up with the best new idea for a new business line at the Marshall Project that anybody had in the 5 years since the business started. And that was, we needed to circulate our news inside prison where people don't have the internet and don't have access to the marshallproject.org. We needed to be on paper. And Lawrence developed a business plan, how we were going to go to the printers, how we were going to distribute through educational programs and libraries. He had the whole thing laid out. And that was when I realized that hiring somebody who was formerly incarcerated was not like a nice thing to do. It was a really smart business decision. And I'd like to ask Lawrence to come up and say a few words about News Inside, our new print publication, and what it's like to be formerly incarcerated and employed, I hope, happily at the Marshall Project. Do you want to stand at the podium now? Just so people can hear you?
Okay, thank you, everyone. And as Carroll said, I'm formerly incarcerated. Unfortunately, I was incarcerated when I was 17 years old, and I did 27 years and 2 months in prison. And I found that the conversation here was just so interesting. The panelists hit on all the points that I had circulated in my head, because this is something that's personally I'm passionate about. I know so many men and women that are formerly incarcerated because, as the population through the country decreases now, there's so many people on the outside. And so many of those people are looking for work and sometimes just can't find it because of their records. Now, while I was incarcerated, doing the 27 years, I had no thought of being in the journalism business. I had no idea that's what I would do. But while on the inside, I kept myself busy, not because I wanted to prove something to the administrators. I kept myself busy because that's who I am. I wanted to do positive things. I wanted to create things on the inside. I wanted to get education where inside of a classroom and the professor would say, here's a test that's coming out, it's kind of difficult. I was like, can you give me a harder test than that one? It was because that's what I wanted to do, to prove to myself that I can do it, but it also became a way of life. And I'm not remarkable. There's many people on the inside are just the same way, just do the same thing, but they're not given a chance. But when I came out and I got the opportunity to work with the Marshall Project, it had been, 27 years. So I came out in May. Today makes 1 year and 5 days I've been free. And I came out in May and I started working with the Marshall Project in July. So in May was the first time I had ever seen the internet, the first time. So when I came to the Marshall Project, I was tasked with learning about the business by learning about our product, which is on the internet that I didn't have while I was on the inside. So while learning the internet, I'm also learning my phone, I'm learning how to use Google Docs, I'm learning how to use all these different technologies that I wasn't aware of before. And in doing that and working there and not being a journalist, I saw the need. I saw what was missing inside of my company, and I pitched News Inside in order to fill that void. And I'm not saying I'm special, I'm not bragging, I just want to give you an example of what somebody who is formerly incarcerated can do, because News Inside was just released in February, and already it's a print publication, mind you, and print media seems to be dying in this country. But within just over 60 days' time, it's in 34 states, it's in Canada, and in 251 facilities, where I promised the Marshall Project I would get them in 10 in 1 year. So imagine if other people like me was given a chance, no matter what the sector is. I don't care if they didn't have a financial background or background in a Fortune 500 company with all these this intricate technology they have to learn how to mix chemicals in order to make products. It doesn't matter. What matters is if the person has the ability to learn, and that ability to learn is married to that person's drive. How do you assess drive? A person has a drive, a person can do anything. And the difference between people who are formerly incarcerated, particularly those who did a long period of time in prison, is that we have been as low as it can be. I'm not going to explain all the atrocities that we suffered while inside. You've read about it. You've probably seen it before. Just imagine being 17-year-old with 27 years, all the things I have gone through. So when I come out and I see people getting mad because someone drove their car in front of them quickly and road rage, or someone at my job said something behind my back, and all those things that become background noise that affect their performance. When stuff like that happened to me, I say, so what? So what? I'm given the opportunity. Someone believes in me. And if someone believes in me to put food on the table, to provide for my children and my family, and make my parents proud of who I have become after the bad thing I did when I was 17 years old, then I'm going to go hard for that organization. I'm going to go hard for myself because I'm representing not only me, I'm representing the organization, and I'm representing the many people who would come behind me. And that's what I'm going to do. So if those people are given that chance, then that's what they're going to bring to the table, and watch them soar. And I know you talk about how do you identify those people. I would say, well, you can do the Marshall Project model. They have someone like me, and if we're hiring somebody who's formerly incarcerated and I'm in a room, there's some questions that I can ask a person. I can know if a person is real and if a person is not. If you have someone who can recognize those intangibles, then you can have gems in your organization. Then measure the success of the people that person is responsible for hiring. And if that works, that's a model that can be replicated and can be successful. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
I think Lawrence makes a very good point that maybe human resources managers need to be formally incarcerated. They will really have people sense for this community.
We've known a couple.
Lawrence was making an important point that he's not special, that there are many people who are currently incarcerated or formerly incarcerated who would be great workers, but I think it is also fair to say that Lawrence is special. Just wanted to put that out there. If members of the audience have questions, could you raise your hand, and my colleague Ruth will bring you a microphone. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I appreciate everything that's been said. And I'm formerly incarcerated myself. I spent 15 years in jail from the age of 16 to the age of 31. And what I want to say is we have to start humanizing people. The reality is this. Years ago, it was a problem with people with disabilities working in certain areas. People who are gay working in certain businesses. Now, the formerly incarcerated person, right? We're people. We're people. I always ask people, when you introduce me, don't say formerly incarcerated anything. Because if you have a friend or a sibling who was a recovering addict, do you introduce them, hey, this is Jenny, she's a recovering addict? Mm-hmm. No, we have to humanize people. Give us chances. The door is closed in our face from day one. But the reality is this, if I can speak for your organization, you want me to do it, but you don't want me to work for you, right? If you want me to promote what your organization is doing, it's okay, but you don't want to hire me. You don't want to hire me. But we're the same people who are complaining behind closed doors about crime keep happening, but we're not hiring people. And it's a known fact through statistics, when people are hiring, crime goes down, right? We can't even get loans when we go to banks. We can't get loans, right? I've been home, this will be my 13th year. Created my own organization since I've been home, but now I'm working for the Campaign for the Fair Sentence of Youth, where we help them formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated juvenile lifers throughout the states. But if we don't give people a chance, we're failing our own society. We're failing our own society. And we can't keep complaining about the same thing. And people are making decisions for us, and we're not at the table. We're not at the table. Why are we not at the table making these decisions? People are making decisions about our life, what we want, what we need, right? But it's the same argument with men, with women. We're making decisions at the table about women, and women are not at the table. That's a problem. That's a problem. And I feel, as a formerly incarcerated person, it's a problem when none of us are at the table able to represent ourselves and what's going on when it's other people at the table. Allow us to be at the table, to be a part of the conversation. And if you really think that we should be forgiven, we should have a place at the table. Right. We should be allowed to take care of our family. We should be allowed to be productive citizens in the community, right? So that's what I'm asking. And I really appreciate your fight to keep us working. I really do. Because the reality is some people say they want that, but not open up that door for people. So I really appreciate your fight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Jody.
Hi. So I have the privilege of working with Eddie. But I just first wanted to say I actually, a quarter of my staff were convicted of murder as children and are among the most extraordinary employees that I have ever had, and are certainly top performers and brilliant and wise individuals, just like the people who are still serving in prison. And I think it's important for all of us to state explicitly, there are extraordinary, brilliant, wise people incarcerated right now, and that's how we should be talking about this population. But I do think, for those who have restrictions that ban people based on their crime and don't do these individual assessments, they're missing out. Because I have seen firsthand just how extraordinary these individuals are and how great they are as employees. My question is for Ms. Martin about just what sort of best practices you recommend to employers for dealing with trauma, because the reality is that even a day in prison is traumatic, not to mention the experiences that occurred before someone enters the justice system. So can you just share a little bit about how you're advising employers on how to address that as they're employing these individuals?
Absolutely. So I'm going to piggyback on something Jeff had said. So when we work with employers to say, okay, you're ready to do this, let's go into implementation mode. One of the first things we do is we say, let's get you an innovative recruiting partner. That's what we call it. And that is a nonprofit in your particular community that is going to be serving this group of people. And it does two things. First of all, it absolutely guarantees you're getting this talent in front of you. Most employers don't realize that they've sent community signals saying, I don't hire, accidentally, or maybe intentionally. Some of them intentionally do that. But you have to signal you're open for business. You have to signal, like, I will even assess you and bring you in, and I'd like you to. But using those wraparound supports as their support system. Because at the end of the day, I should be very clear, it is not the company's job to be charitable or to be a social worker or to do that. Your job is to make your product, make your service, make money, but also do right by your people. And so some people go above and beyond and have navigators in their organization, which is amazing. But I'll tell you at Dave's, we've been doing this for decades. We talk about it all the time. We do nothing special for people with backgrounds. Everybody has the exact same benefits, the same access to everything. We have the same wraparound supports for everybody that we have. When we do talk with employers and we're doing a workshop and we're breaking down things that you might come across and we get tricky questions, right? Like the ones that people are having a hard time rumbling with. We do like to remind people, if you've been incarcerated or you're working with somebody that has, there's a myriad of different triggers and you're not gonna know every single one. One that I've mentioned before to folks and they go, I never would have thought, is that there are a number of institutions that have housed men where the word gentleman has become a negative word. The way that it has been used as this demeaning, demoralizing thing because of the tone and the perception that it's delivered by the CO. And so there's these things that we wouldn't think about if we'd been incarcerated that are going to impact that person. And so what we do caution, or not even caution, just say, be aware of looking at the people you hire. So if you're in a meeting and you say, all right, ladies and gentlemen, and you see somebody kind of seize up a little bit, like, be receptive and pay attention, because that's not special to somebody incarcerated, right? Like, you know nothing about me, but I come from an extremely challenging childhood and was a ward of the state for a while and had a terrible father. I have my own triggers, but you don't know that because it's not on a piece of paper or a rap sheet that you could look up at some point in time. So at our core, we're coming back to humanize the individual, acknowledge their value just as a human and the dignity that needs to come with that. Because a lot of us have experienced trauma in some way, shape, or form. If you know your individual that you're working with has been incarcerated, you just get extra information, quite honestly. You get to go into that conversation already knowing, I know nothing about this person's experience unless you've been incarcerated. I'm going to be extra sensitive to the signals they give me. And also, as an employer, be willing to have those uncomfortable conversations. It's really easy to say, like, okay, I'll hire people, but I don't want to talk about it. You know what? You're going to at some point in time. If you're in HR, you've had uncomfortable conversations, you've had tricky ones. My very first one, I completely screwed it up and thought I would get fired, quite honestly. But you need to be willing to be human in that dialogue and in that interaction, because the other person is not comfortable either. They don't want to tell you everything that's just happened in their life and why they made a mistake and how terrible it was and how it destroyed maybe another family and their family and them. But you know what? They're showing up for that conversation, so we owe that conversation to also stand up and have that one.
I'll jump in also. Having mentoring available, either workplace mentoring. Anyone who wants to build a diverse workforce is well advised to have mentoring, because people come from different experiences and may not have the, the social capital that I have, and people to go to. There are great nonprofit organizations, reentry, that focus on this too. There's one in Las Vegas, Hope for Prisoners, that has an 18-month mentoring program. Some nonprofits offer lifetime mentoring, so people can navigate these problems themselves as well.
Interesting. Yes, ma'am. Oh, sorry.
I want to thank you. I was trying to figure out why I was invited to this, and I think maybe Thurgood Marshall's wife had something to do with this. My name is Reverend Jacqueline Norris. I work in environmental justice, and one of the things that I want to say is that what you mentioned was already created. If you think about how the concept of the HR process, it was about helping the workers in the 1930s and 40s. And if you think about the concept, the unemployment offices had navigators for the prisoners. And so what I'm seeing is that a recreation of a need, because it's like a plantation concept. You need workers again. And very interesting. When one looks at how you deal with prisoners, and let me say, my brother, you probably saw him with Obama. He was the only one who was incarcerated for nothing. His name is Rudolph Norris. Georgetown, everyone had him. It was my sister and my ability to understand how to move in a system that was discriminatory with judge and federal individuals to say that my brother will be released. And when you know how to work the agenda under the table, something will happen. So this is a good concept, but what you said, my brother, is that when I travel all over the nation, Midwest, and talk to people who have money, as I call them, the power brokers, one of the things you must understand is they don't need to sit at the table. They need to set the table. And when you have the concept with them, to have them and listen to them, then they will be more vital to you, because you have built a relationship, not because small businesses want to be anchor institutions and build wealth again for the middle class, but I'll leave that there. But I just wanted to say that, because there is more to this than what is on the table, and that's all I'm going to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Norris. A gentleman in the back, thank you.
Who's been very patient. That was the first hand that went up.
Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm turned the wrong way, I didn't see it.
No problem, it's all good. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Pilly Greenfield, and I am also a returning citizen. I am a graduate of a partnership that was developed through the Mayor's Office of Returning Citizens and Georgetown University. They developed a paralegal program for returning citizens like myself so that we could go through their rigorous paralegal program, and all of us are now currently employed at some of the top law firms within D.C. Since our graduation, some of my classmates and I have started a consulting firm to address the needs of businesses on best practices on how to address what returning citizens need in terms of dealing with businesses and ways that reentry can be applied in the business sector. One of my personal drives, I believe that the free market is the solution to a lot of the problems that we see. And my comment and my question is to the panel. We touched on it, and I heard the brother speak about loans and about funding earlier. And a lot of the talk that we've had tonight has been in the employment sector. But what we haven't really talked about is what the loan process looks like and the funding process looks like. We are in the process of seeking funding. We are a for-profit business. We chose to go that way intentionally. We didn't choose to go the nonprofit route because we believe we bring value to the table. And those of us that work in the nonprofit sector know that if you're a nonprofit, your business is fundraising. That is your first business. We believe we add value, and we wanted to go a different route. And in that regard, what we have found is that there is a lack of venture capital that has poured into the minority community as is. That is further exacerbated for those of us who are returning citizens. You know, when I began to study venture capitalism and understand how some of these multi-billion-dollar corporations were funded, they talk about things like seed funding. And in that seed funding, they have something called the burn rate, where it's expected that the business will not make any money for a certain amount of years. We can look at two of the biggest companies, Uber and Lyft, who just went public and they still have yet to turn a profit. And when we look at that in the context of what is happening with returning citizens, you know, I'm in the process now of trying to become a certified business entity with my partner. I want to acknowledge my partner, I'm sorry, Mr. Eric Spencer, who's sitting over there. He's one of my business partners as well. As we try to sit down and get all of our paperwork together, and banks ask us for things like 3 years of tax returns, when one of my business partners, you know, is about 6 months out from giving back a life sentence. You know, and so when we talk about things in financing in that regard, and we try to sit down, you know, I don't care how good of a job I may be able to craft some pro forma financial statements in order to present to a bank. At the end of the day, you know, businesses and banks have business models, and they sit down with, there's a risk assessment that's done on us. And so I guess my question is, how do we begin to turn the tide so that we see some of this venture capital begin to flow into the hands of minorities, but particularly returning citizens?
Great question. Thank you very much. Jeff, you're
So,
the resident banker here.
Yeah, well, I guess I'd start out by saying banks aren't sources of venture capital. That's not what they do. It's someone else's money, so it can't be lent in high-risk enterprises. There are obstacles to returning citizens with banking. We created what it's called. It's assembly a second chance account, so people who might otherwise be disqualified from getting a basic account have access to that. But one of the ways that we see this gap being filled is training and entrepreneurship. The Brian Hamilton Foundation is a really neat organization that has the Inmates to Entrepreneurs program. And it's fairly new, but Brian is a well-known, well-regarded entrepreneur himself who, in the Research Triangle Park area in the Carolinas, built from scratch a very successful software business, sold it, and is pouring this back into driving entrepreneurship for veterans. And really two main focuses, veterans, and the other is returning citizens. And I think it's a really exciting program, and he's the person who should be teaching it.
Interesting.
There's also, I'd recommend looking at 068 Ventures. They're working on expanding, so I think a key piece to this, because there's over 10,000 collateral consequences to having a criminal background, and this is just one of many. So looking at folks that have already done some sort of entrepreneurship place. So Daniel Bull, who created 068 Ventures, had a felony conviction. It was financially related. He ended up building an incubator, sourcing it with his own money, and is now helping build other businesses specifically for people with backgrounds.
Fascinating. Okay, we have only a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask people to really, if you could come quickly to a question so that we can get
Absolutely.
more people in.
My name is Chesley Swan. I'm an associate at the Rabin Group. And so my question is, as a country, how do we understand and come to terms with people incarcerated for marijuana, but now the marijuana industry is becoming such a thing? I think the next wave of people, like the gold rush of finance. So how do we merge that and understand that and get folks for the finance?
That's an excellent question. You know, it's one of those areas of justice reform that I'm really, really concerned with. By the way, the other one is how juveniles get charged as adults. That's the other one that we have to think about in this country. But I think that's a very good one. In Pennsylvania, we're really trying to work hard to say, okay, once we start saying that we're not going to enforce these laws against certain people going forward, then we have to look backwards and say, okay, now what's the consequences of a shift in societal values? And so I think it's a really important thing, because there's a ton of people, particularly African-American young men, who have records for something that's essentially something that increasingly we're judging to be a relatively benign thing.
Important. We have time for one more question. Oh, you two can fight it out, yeah. Or do you want to just both ask your questions, and then we'll just take them together and try to, yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for coming here this evening. Where do you think the recovery of more quality post-secondary correctional education fits into all this?
Recovery?
College and prison. So college and prison and
College and
vocational education,
Thank you.
apprenticeships.
Super question, and ma'am, if you could ask yours.
about a lot of companies who have implemented these great practices, but a lot of them are coming from the top down. What advice do you have for those of us who are trying to do it at more of a grassroots level and have maybe some support but are running up against barriers with either HR or managers who are questioning these practices?
I'll take the second question.
Go ahead.
I'm not touch the first one. So the second question, find me afterwards. I'll give you my card. So we actually help companies kind of self-assess. What do we do? At the end of the day, you need best employment practices in place. And so you can kind of infiltrate from within and decide, like, do we already do these things? Because you probably do, which means the very next thing is, how do you sell it inside? So what are those talking points for leadership, for HR? If I don't have the perfect answer, I know the expert that does. And so if that's employment, insurance, anything in the risk mitigation space is probably what you're going to come up against, or performance of people in the workforce that have backgrounds. So we can help you with that. So that way you can kind of push back and be what I would call an intrapreneur. And then we can either talk about how you start sourcing people right away, hopefully, and kind of signaling you're open for business, or some people feel a little safer if they do a project and they do a little pilot project first. They get a couple easy wins under their belt, and then the company goes, why the heck haven't we been doing this for decades? That's also a good way to go.
And I'll jump in on the gentleman's question. There was a recent study by the RAND Corporation, the think tank, that showed that the best return is education. And it actually surprised me. I thought vocational training would have a higher return, but the best route to lowering recidivism is educational opportunities inside prisons.
I also think that early on you stated something that I think is incredibly important. Most employers don't know how to break into a new area of workforces. It's these organizations that you talked about that actually need to be the bridge between employers. I mentioned that we have the Year Up thing with kids who are coming from deprived areas, inner city areas. But what that program does is it puts kids through a rigorous thing. And if you go through that, you have to show up. You can't be 1 minute late, et cetera, et cetera. When a kid leaves that, I can then turn to my people and say, this kid has the bona fides to do it. If you ask me just to hire kids off the street, it's a lot harder for me to hire those kids off the street. So those intermediate programs are incredibly important because they can, in essence, vouch for people. That, I think, is a really important thing. We talked about it an hour and a half ago, but as I listen to that, that's the best practice that I'm going to take away from here.
And they have to do it right.
They have to do it right,
They have
exactly.
to put forward the person who's most ready to work, not the person in greatest need, which is sometimes the impulse in some nonprofits.
Interesting. I want to ask you all to join me in thanking our three marvelous panelists.